So I like history. Like anyone else, it's a really good subject. You can learn lots of it. You can learn history, you can learn causes, effects of history, and even how this might affect present decisions, and so forth. But one thing that you can guarantee about the right wing, not just in this country, but seemingly in any country, is that they love to use history to twist stuff to suit their causes and or facts. And one of the big things that you are seeing a lot of is the Brexiteer cry that we stood alone during World War II and that's why we don't need anyone. Well, allow me to once again debunk this notion. So, the Brexiteer notion that we stood alone in the war is historically illiterate. Britain remained globalised and this was critical to its success. So, analogies between Brexit and the Second World War appear to be in vogue. References to Britain's surviving the Blitz and being able to get through a no-deal exit are now a staple trope of TV vox pops. In recent weeks, a few fair commenters have argued that a country which stood alone against the Nazis after Dunkirk can surely handle some custom delays in the aftermath of a sudden Halloween Brexit. Much talk of this is simple nonsense. Some of it, though, is potentially damaging nonsense, and most of it appears to be based on a post-war myths and half-remembered Sunday afternoon viewings of black and white historical films on actual history. There's a reason that May and June of 1940 crop up so much on our political discourse. This provides perhaps the most founding myth of modern British history. This is Churchill's assumption of power at the head of the coalition government. Britain standing alone against a Nazi-dominant continent and the decision to fight on against German aggression, Lowe's cartoon of the defiant British Tommy raising his fist to the sea, saying, "Very well, alone, perhaps is the canonical image." But Britain never stood alone. The war was fought by the British Empire, not by the United Kingdom. Indeed, Churchill's language at the time was almost always imperial. The notion that the British Isles stood alone in 1940 would have confused contemporary observers. And allied to that empire in the mid-1940, there were many of the governments in exile and their colonies and fleets of Western Europe. The confusion, however, runs deeper. In the post-war years, the story of the war and how it was fought had become more nostalgic. In reality, Britain's war, like Britain itself, was globalised. Take, for example, the question of food. In the popular imagination, food in the wartime Britain is framed around the idea of rationing and posters urging people to dig for victory. While rationing was implemented and domestic agriculture did step up its activities, the focus on this obscures much of its realities. Only a quarter of food expenditure went on ration food in 1940, and around 1/3 from 1942 onwards, staples like bread, potatoes and vegetables were never rationed, in sharp contrast to the continental experience. As for domestic food production, yes, it stepped up, but Britain remained reliant on imports. The Britain of the first half of the 20th century was, in modern economic parlance, extremely globalised. Food was imported from Denmark and the Netherlands, from Australasia and South America. Food imports during the war were reduced as measured by bulk to save shipping space, that for more important, which was a switch in the type of food. The overall tonnage for human consumption imported was reduced by about a quarter, but the number of calories per ton rose by about 25%. Meat imports rose as fruit and vegetables imports contracted. Food imports remained crucial to feeding the British Isles. Not that many Britons were actually digging for victory. Employment in domestic agriculture rose from around 800,000 to just below 1 million. A tiny share of the country of 46 million. By contrast, in Germany was around 1/3 of the population was working on the land. The key point is that Britain's politicians and military strategists welcomed its globalization and in the main rejected calls for national self-sufficiency and even calls for imperial self-sufficiency. Britain's reliance on important food was seen as a strength, not a weakness. It meant that fewer Britons had to work in the fields and we put more into military uniform or into factories producing the weapons and munitions needed to sustain the war effort. Britain possessed a large mercantile navy boasted by the merchant marines of Denmark, Norway, Belgium and the Netherlands and Greece, and sufficient power to keep the sea lanes open. In June of 1940, after Hitler's conquest of Western Europe, the British elite remained confident of victory. At best, Hitler could draw on the resources of Europe and until June of 1941, some vital economic support from the Soviet Union, while Britain retained access to the resources of the rest of the world, including never before she had entered, even before she had entered the war, the North American industrial might. Indeed, the real moment of danger, when the British elite were at their most fearful, came not from when France in the mid-1940 when she fell, but the fall of Singapore and Malaya to Japan in 1942. The potential loss of control of critical resources in Asia was a much bigger threat to Britain's ability to sustain a war, and yet nowadays it is almost forgotten in the popular narrative of the conflict. The foundation myth of modern Britain, like all good myths, is rooted in actual events. But the notion of Britain as a self-reliant power standing alone is a dangerous one, and one that no member of the 1940s war cabinet would have recognised. So, as usual, the Brexiteers are wrong and they are twisting history to once again suit their purposes.